Hi, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. I want to give a quick primer on how to read Joshua through 2nd Kings and even into Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. Again, the story of Israel's life in the land that moves from Joshua's generation coming into the land all the way to the end of 2nd Kings, where Israel finds itself into exile. And then we'll also talk a little bit about what happens during the return. But let's first start with Joshua through 2nd Kings. And I want to cover these basic themes: faithful obedience, the Davidic covenant, kingship, temple, exile, and return, and touch base on how these texts set this up. But first of all, again, remember the story. The book of Joshua tells the story of how Joshua takes over for Moses, and God calls Joshua to lead God's people into the land of Canaan. They cross the Jordan River, and they, through God's aid, are able to take possession of the land of Canaan in dramatic fashion. The model that Joshua's generation shows is what happens when God's people are faithful to God. Again, Joshua's call was to be strong and courageous, and in particular to follow the book of the law that Moses had given to God's people. That's Joshua 1:1-9. You can take a look at Joshua's call. And again, Joshua at the end of his life in chapters 23 and 24 gives Israel a strong charge, including be strong and courageous. Some of you probably even have your own homes have that text from Joshua 24. Choose this day who you will serve. As for me and my household, I will serve the Lord. That's Joshua's witness. The only exception to Joshua's generation and their spectacular faithfulness comes right after the Jericho account, where Israel's defeated because of the sin of one family who had took possession of several elements that were there in Jericho. That was Achan's family. And what Joshua sets up then is this model where as long as God's people are faithful, they're successful. So it doesn't depend on the strength of Israel, on their battle plans, on how cunning they are. It simply depends on faithfulness. And this is one of the key pieces that Israel's life in the land, it's a snapshot of the potential and the pitfalls of living as God's missional people in the world. Israel has great potential. God's people have great potential when they are faithful. And what these stories also do is they serve as a case study about the dangers of disobedience. But again, the key here is that these stories are a testimony to the power of faithfulness. And Joshua and that generation models faithfulness. Now, immediately, there's a second case study that kicks in. If Joshua, everything goes well except for one time, the very next book, the book of Judges, offers a contrasting look. In some ways, that's surprising because it looks like everything is going great after the book of Joshua. Then we find out in Judges that Israel actually has trouble taking possession of the land. And the trouble there, and one of the key passages you're going to want to have a look at is 2:6-3:6. It sets up this paradigm that the rest of the book of Judges traces, where you have essentially disobedience, which leads to oppression, which leads to crying out, which leads to deliverance. And this spiral captures Israel's problem during the book of Judges and that whole history. But what we do, if you read the book carefully, things get worse. Every judge gets worse. And so by the end of the book of Judges, chapter 17-21, Samson, who's kind of the paradigm for a messed up judge, after his life, you have these really bizarre and sometimes actually awful stories in Judges 17-21. And the refrain that runs through there, in those days there was no king. Every person did what was right in his own eyes. And so we just have chaos. This spirals backwards into chaos and disorder with a need for a king. And so faithfulness, and this goes through, and when you read Israel's history, the one thing that the Bible does is it does record the potential and the positivity that comes out of faithfulness, but the Old Testament does not sugarcoat the danger, the destructive potential of unfaithfulness. And so it traces and records multiple stories of Israel's failings. And that's not just in Judges, it moves throughout beyond that. So once we get through the book of Judges, we get to Samuel. And the books of Samuel show the rise of kingship in Israel. And this is the next piece. Again, of course, the first king in the book of Samuel is Saul, and he's followed quickly by David. And when you read the books of Samuel, you can't quite tell, does God really want Israel to have a king, or does God not want Israel to have a king? Well, it's a little bit of both. The key piece is Israel can have a king. In fact, Deuteronomy 17 gave instructions for what to do with the king. And the king was supposed to be a student of the book of the law, wasn't supposed to have too many wives, have too many horses, which was military power, or acquire too much wealth. Instead, he was to lead Israel in faithfulness. That's the king that God wants. But what the problem is, and what the Bible's against, is a king like the nations, because this is the key piece. When we talk about a king like the nations, the king stands in for some god. There's always a god. But in a sense, the king functions as God. And what that means is a king like the nations, the king creates law. And again, the king's above the law because the king creates law. And this is the problem. When God's people wanted the king like the nations, God doesn't want that, because that then puts all the power in a king who creates law. And as you can see, this is kind of the model for how kingship has tended to work in human history. Now, the book of Deuteronomy, it said, yeah, there's a king, and God's ideal king is, of course, Yahweh is Israel's king. That's the bottom line. And Yahweh has revealed a means by which to live out faithfulness, and that's the Torah, or the law. And it's within this context that the Israelite king functions. The king functions not so much as a creator of law, but instead what? This is a key piece. The king is the administrator of the law. The king, the model for faithfulness, rather than a generator of law. So a totally different paradigm. And so the scriptures were for this kind of king. And in the Bible, the model for this is King David. Because it gets down to his heart. And that issue of heart, if you go back to Deuteronomy, the heart is God intended what David had a heart for God. In other words, David's intentions, David's will, David's thinking was directed in alignment to be faithful to the law. Now, of course, David had issues. I mean, we in the Bible doesn't whitewash that, but the summative take on David was that David had a heart after God, a person after God's own heart. He intended what God intended. And so David models that. And as far as other kings in the books of Kings, Hezekiah and Josiah serve essentially as the next best couple of kings because of their faithfulness to the law. All the rest of the kings have issues. These are the stars in the whole field here, these three. And you can read about them as you're reading through these texts. Now, the Davidic covenant then is a key piece. So we already had the Mosaic covenant, which is the central part of the Pentateuch. The next big covenant that's critical for understanding the Old Testament is the Davidic covenant. And this comes in 2 Samuel 7. And the issue here is God promises David to have a perpetual line of descendants who are going to sit on the throne. This is critical because this is God's unconditional promise to David's descendants, and this gives God's people hope in all circumstances because, the promises, the abiding promises, is this is going to be an eternal kingship. This is where the whole idea of a messianic hope comes into play, because Messiah simply means the anointed one, and so when an Israelite king was anointed king, they were seen as the Messiah. Now, a messianic hope really kicks in Israel's story post-exile when the kingship is wiped out. And then when God's people are reading these promises to David, they're waiting for and hoping for God's renewal of the promises to David. We'll pick this up again when we look at the prophets and then when we see how Jesus fulfills these things. So when Jesus comes and shows up and says, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, Jesus is announcing that that long-awaited restoration of David and David's kingdom, the kingdom of God, is now at hand. So that's the Davidic covenant, that's kingship. Temple, King Solomon builds a temple. This is a way of making a permanent site for the tabernacle that was built in the book of Exodus and that whole cultic apparatus that is explained in Leviticus. And temple becomes central to God's people. And in these books, temple and kingship gets linked together in a sense that the king is in Jerusalem, the temple's in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, Mount Zion, becomes the second significant mountain in the Old Testament after Sinai. Well, when you read the stories of the kings, again, there's a couple good kings, there's a couple exemplary kings, but most of the rest of the kings, what are we going to say? They're bozos. And by bozos, we mean they're completely unfaithful. All the northern kings are unfaithful because of what? Because of the worshiping of the golden calves and the idolatry. Most of the southern kings are also unfaithful because of those things. And this ultimately leads to exile. In 587, a Babylonian exile, where God's people are carried off to Babylon, Jerusalem's destroyed. And the return happens a generation later when the Persians defeat the Babylonians and allow God's people to return. They ultimately rebuild the temple around 516, though they'd been back for a while. The stories of Ezra and Nehemiah tell of these stories. Now, this whole issue of faithful obedience, love God, love neighbor. Again, the flips of those are the sins that Israel continually commits in these historical books, if you want to call them that. The flip of loving God is idolatry or syncretism. That's when Yahweh alone is supposed to be God, as we talked about when we talked about the Shema last week. But in context where Yahweh alone isn't God, and you mix in other gods and goddesses, that's syncretism. Or if you just completely abandon Yahweh for another god, that's out and out idolatry. So idolatry, syncretism, the following after of other gods, the moving away from an exclusive commitment to Yahweh alone as God, is sin number one. Sin number two, the second thing, would be social injustice. That's the opposite of loving neighbor. And so these stories show what happens when God's people practice idolatry or syncretism and injustice. And that ultimately leads to exile, which leads to a return. But at the end of Israel's story, the issue is Israel's back. But as we saw in the history, Israel's back. They even rebuilt the temple, but they have no king. They're not autonomous. They're under the control of empires of the world. And essentially, at this point, Israel begins to form the early parts of what we would call the emergence of Judaism and the expectation of what God is going to do next, which is going to lead us into the New Testament. We're getting a little ahead of the story because we're still looking at Israel's story of its life in the land and its exile and return. But those are the issues that we're going to face. So again, to read these books profitably, look at the theme of faithful obedience and its opposites. David, kingship, Davidic covenant, temple, the exile, and the return. And if you can understand those concepts, you'll get a handle on this part of the Bible, which again traces the potential and the pitfalls of living as God's missional people in the world. I'm Brian Russell. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to conversation about the concepts in this part of the scriptures with you. Have a wonderful day.